She had never been kissed. He had never loved. A marriage contract, 18 months living together, 0 feelings allowed. But when her hands touched the piano that night, something in that millionaire's frozen heart began to break. Where are you watching from? Subscribe to the channel and leave your like to discover if true love can be born from an agreement as cold as ice. Emily's hand trembled as she signed the marriage documents, leaving a small blue ink smudge on her surname that would in a few hours be replaced by another. The notary, a man with tired eyes who had witnessed thousands of similar unions, barely looked up from the paper. For him, this was simply another transaction on an ordinary day. For her, it represented the sacrifice of all her youthful dreams on the altar of family necessity. At 20 years old, Emily had never felt the warmth of a passionate kiss, nor experienced the tingle of male hands intertwined with hers with true intention. And now she was binding her life to that of a stranger who observed her with the same clinical attention he would devote to an unfavorable balance sheet. Michael's cologne, woody notes mixed with something indefinably bitter, invaded her senses when he leaned forward to sign his part of the contract. She couldn't help but notice that her future husband at 39 hadn't smiled once during the entire ceremony in that cold, silent law office in Manhattan. Sometimes we build cages believing they are refuges, she thought as she watched her signature, still with her maiden name dry on the official paper. The phrase had been her grandmother's, a woman who had lived in a loveless but respectful marriage, and now it resonated in her mind like a premonition. The notary cleared his throat, breaking the moment of introspection. "Congratulations, you are officially husband and wife," he announced with the same emotion with which he might have read the weather forecast. "You may kiss if you wish." Michael's eyes, a steely grey that reminded her of the Hudson River during a storm, briefly met hers. A flicker of something, discomfort, compassion, regret, crossed his face before he placed a brief formal kiss on Emily's cheek. The contact lasted less than a second, but it was enough for her to perceive the tension in his jaw. Outside, New York City bustled with the chaotic, vibrant energy of midday. Fifth Avenue, a few blocks away, would be filled with hurried executives, street vendors, and occasional tourists. Life continued its normal course, while hers had just changed forever. "The car is waiting," said Michael, his deep voice devoid of any identifiable emotion. "The reception is scheduled for 2. Emily nodded, pressing against her chest the small bouquet of white calla lilies she had bought that morning. There was no wedding dress or veil, just an ivory suit that had belonged to her mother. There would be no honeymoon, just a return to an apartment in the Upper East Side that, despite its generous space and privileged views of Central Park, felt as cold as the intentions behind that marriage. The young woman had grown up in a traditional family in Charleston, South Carolina, where every Sunday the sound of the church piano filled the air with melodies she herself had played since she was 7. Her delicate hands knew the ivory keys better than any human touch. Extremely shy, she avoided direct gazes and prolonged conversations, finding refuge in the old books of the local library and the sacred music scores she collected like treasures. Now, as she observed New York from the window of Michael's black Mercedes, she wondered if this cosmopolitan city, so different from her native Charleston, would ever feel like home. Or if, on the contrary, the agreement she had just signed would simply be a new type of loneliness, more elegant but equally empty. Michael's apartment occupied the top floor of an Art Deco building in the heart of the Upper East Side. High ceilings decorated with original moldings, meticulously preserved hardwood floors, and large windows that framed Central Park as if it were a living painting. A space any New Yorker would consider a privilege to inhabit, but which for Emily, during those first weeks, was nothing more than a gilded cage. Her routine was established with the regularity of a metronome. Michael left before dawn. "Urgent matters," he would mutter without looking directly at her, and returned well after midnight. His presence in the apartment manifested only through subtle evidence. The persistent aroma of his strong coffee in the kitchen, work notes scattered on the marble table, or the slight change in position of some book from the library. One morning, exactly 3 weeks after the wedding, Emily dared to ask during the brief moment they coincided in the kitchen, "Do you always work so late?" Michael looked up from his tablet, where he was reviewing what appeared to be financial charts, with an expression suggesting he had momentarily forgotten he shared his dwelling with someone else. "The Asian market opens when it's night here," he responded in a neutral tone, as one explaining something obvious. "I need to be available for video conferences with Shanghai and Singapore." "I understand," she murmured, though she didn't really understand. In her previous world, work had reasonable hours and people dined together around a table. "Our arrangement doesn't require me to justify my schedule, Emily," he added, returning to his charts. "You have freedom to organize your time as you prefer. Mrs. Parker comes to clean on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. My assistant has left a credit card in the drawer of your desk for your expenses." Our arrangement, not our marriage. The distinction was subtle, but revealing. During those first months, Emily spent her days exploring the city. She walked through Central Park observing street performers, lost herself in the galleries of the Met, or sat in some cafe on Madison Avenue pretending to be just another New Yorker. But she always returned to the apartment before nightfall, preparing southern dishes like shrimp and grits or chicken and dumplings that inevitably ended up cooling without being touched. The loneliness in that Art Deco palace was deeper than any loneliness she had known in the cobblestone streets of Charleston. There, at least, neighbors greeted her by name. Elderly ladies invited her for sweet tea on flower-filled porches, and Sundays brought the ritual comfort of her piano sessions at the church. One afternoon, while organizing her few belongings in the immense closet that now belonged to her, technically at least, she found a forgotten photograph between the empty drawers. It showed a much younger Michael, perhaps her current age, smiling genuinely alongside an older woman of aristocratic appearance. What struck her most was precisely that smile, open, sincere, completely different from the contained expression he showed now. The photograph disappeared the next day. Emily never mentioned having found it, and Michael never gave any signs of having missed it. Like so many other things in that strange cohabitation, the episode remained suspended in the limbo of the unspoken. The true purpose of that marriage hovered between them like a ghost they both pretended not to see. Emily's family vineyard was on the verge of financial collapse. Her father, an honest but naive businessman, had signed guarantees he didn't fully understand. Michael had appeared as an unlikely savior, offering a solution wrapped in specific conditions. A marriage of convenience, maintained for 18 months, time enough to reassure investors and satisfy his grandmother. A demanding Virginia matriarch who conditioned her inheritance on her grandson's marriage. There would be no intimacy, no love, just mutual convenience under the same roof of that apartment with privileged views. A contract with an expiration date, like special promotions in supermarkets. One winter dawn, when the cold wind blew forcefully over New York and the city's silence was interrupted only by the occasional sound of a solitary car, Emily couldn't fall asleep. The shadows in her room seemed to move with a life of their own, and the cold infiltrated through some invisible crack, resisting the efforts of central heating. After 2 hours of tossing among the Egyptian cotton sheets, she decided to go down to the kitchen in search of a tea that might help her sleep. The apartment, immersed in half-light, seemed different during the early morning hours. Less intimidating, somehow more intimate, as if in darkness the spaces lost their defined edges and, with them, something of their inherent coldness. It was then that she saw it, a grand piano she had never noticed before, placed in a corner of the living room and partially covered by a crimson velvet cloth. How was it possible she hadn't noticed it during these months? The answer came almost immediately. That wing of the apartment always remained closed, and she, respecting the unspoken boundaries established by Michael, had never tried to open it. As if drawn by an invisible magnet, she approached the instrument. Her fingers caressed the polished surface, before completely removing the protective fabric. The dim light filtering from the street lamps reflected on the black lacquer, creating the illusion that the piano breathed softly. Without thinking of the possible consequences, Emily sat on the bench. Her hands found the keys instinctively, and music began to flow from her like water too long contained that finally found a crack through which to escape. The notes of Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue filled the room, transforming the cold apartment into a living, pulsating space, charged with emotion. She was so absorbed in the music that she didn't hear the main door open, nor did she perceive the footsteps that stopped abruptly at the threshold of the living room. Only when the last note dissipated in the air did the subsequent silence reveal to her that she was no longer alone. Michael remained motionless at the entrance, his Italian leather briefcase still in one hand, the other frozen in the act of loosening his tie. His face, usually so controlled, showed an expression she couldn't decipher, something between surprise, confusion, and longing. For the first time since she'd known him, he seemed genuinely disarmed. "I'm sorry," Emily hastened to apologize, rising so abruptly she almost knocked over the bench. "I didn't know you had a piano here. I didn't mean to—" "You play extraordinarily well," he interrupted. His voice sounded different, less metallic, with a texture she hadn't heard before. "Thank you," she responded, confused by the unexpected compliment. "I studied since childhood. In Charleston, I played the piano at First Presbyterian every Sunday." A silence stretched between them, but for the first time, it wasn't an uncomfortable one. "Would you play something else?" Michael finally asked, and the most surprising thing wasn't the request itself, but the way he formulated it. Not as an order, not even as a polite suggestion, but as a genuine request, almost vulnerable. She nodded and sat back down. Her fingers found the keys this time to interpret Copland's Appalachian Spring, a piece that had always moved her for its emotional intensity. While playing, she observed from the corner of her eye how Michael removed his coat and took a seat in one of the nearby armchairs, closing his eyes to concentrate on the music. In that moment, something subtly changed between them. Later, reflecting on that night, Emily would understand that it was the first time she saw Michael not as the cold businessman who had signed a contract with her family, but as a human being who carried his own weight of loneliness. After that night, something imperceptible but fundamental changed in the dynamic between Emily and Michael. There was no explicit conversation about it, no grand declarations, but their routine began to transform with the gentleness of a river that patiently modifies the landscape. He started arriving earlier, always with some professional excuse. The video conference with Tokyo was cancelled. We finished the board meeting ahead of schedule, but invariably ended up seated in the leather armchair while she played. Initially, his musical requests were formal and distant. "Do you know anything by Barber?" Or "I'd like to hear Bernstein if you don't mind." With time, they became more personal. "My mother used to hum that melody," or "That piece reminds me of summers in the Hamptons." Brief functional conversations gradually extended. One night, after a particularly emotional interpretation of Samuel Barber's Adagio for Strings, Michael mentioned almost distractedly, "I always wanted to learn to play the piano." Emily looked at him surprised, unable to imagine this controlled and pragmatic man harboring such a desire. "And why didn't you?" she asked with genuine curiosity. Michael seemed to consider whether to respond or not. When he finally spoke, his voice had a tone she had never heard before. "My father believed music was a useless distraction for a man destined to lead a business empire," he explained, looking towards some indefinite point beyond the windows. "In my childhood home there was a piano similar to this one. My mother played wonderfully, but only when he wasn't there. The day he found me trying to imitate one of her melodies, the piano disappeared. I was 7 years old." The confession floated between them, like a fragile bubble that neither dared to touch for fear it might burst. It was the first visible crack in the wall Michael had built around himself, the first indication that behind that marble facade existed a man marked by impossible expectations and emotional absences. "It's never too late to learn," Emily suggested softly, after a moment. He looked at her as if she had just proposed something completely absurd. "I'm almost 40 years old. I have a student in Charleston who began at 65 after retiring," she responded with a small smile. "Now, 3 years later, he plays simple pieces by Bach." Michael seemed to consider the idea, but finally shook his head. "My hands are made for signing contracts, not for creating beauty," he said, and although he tried to make it sound like a joke, there was an underlying sadness in his words that didn't escape Emily's perception. "All hands can create beauty," she responded, surprising herself with her boldness. "They just need the opportunity." That night, before retiring to his room, Michael stopped in the doorway and, without turning, asked, "Are you serious about the lessons?" "Completely," Emily responded. "I'll think about it," he said, and for the first time since she'd known him, Emily thought she detected a glimpse of a genuine smile in his profile. The next morning, she found a simple beginner's sheet music on the piano and a note written in Michael's precise, angular handwriting. "Perhaps you're right. It's never too late to try. That's how the lessons began. Initially, they were brief and somewhat awkward encounters. Michael's large, firm hands, accustomed to the precision of signatures and calculated gestures, appeared clumsy and insecure on the keys. His frustration was palpable, like that of a man habituated to excellence who suddenly found himself a novice. "This is ridiculous," he muttered one night, after making the same mistake for the third consecutive time in a simple passage. "I'm wasting your time." "Learning is never a waste," she responded gently. "Besides, you have a good ear. It's just a matter of practice." "How can you be so patient?" he asked, studying her with an intensity that made her blush. "I suppose it's my nature," she answered, averting her gaze to the sheet music. "Or maybe it's because I understand the frustration. I was once a beginner too." During those sessions, Emily discovered a side of Michael that completely contradicted the image of the ruthless and calculating businessman. Behind his facade of ruthless efficiency was a vulnerable perfectionist, a man who feared failure precisely because he had always demanded perfection of himself. And in that vulnerability, paradoxically, resided a strength she couldn't help but admire, the courage of one who, despite fear, dares to try. In the 5th month of their strange marriage, the letter arrived. The thick cream envelope, with the Thompson family crest embossed in relief, stood out among the bills and commercial correspondence like a solitary rose in a field of weeds. Emily found it upon returning from her morning walk through Central Park. The letter, addressed to both of them, contained an invitation that sounded more like an imperative summons for dinner at the family mansion of Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, Michael's paternal grandmother and undisputed matriarch of the clan. The date was just 10 days away. When Emily showed him the invitation that night, she saw something she had never witnessed before. Michael Thompson, the man who negotiated without blinking with international magnates, appeared genuinely uneasy. "It was inevitable," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "She's waited longer than I expected." "Your grandmother?" Emily asked, though it was evident. "My grandmother," he confirmed, running a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture she had never seen him make. "Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, last representative of Virginia aristocracy, who still believes in arranged marriages and the power of family alliances." "But our marriage," she began, unsure how to formulate the evident contradiction. "Is exactly what she wanted," he interrupted with a humorless smile. "A Thompson married before 40, ensuring the continuity of the lineage and the concentration of the family patrimony. The specific details of our arrangement are irrelevant to her." Emily felt a chill at the veiled mention of those specific details. The fact that their marriage was a business transaction with an expiration date, without love or true intention of permanence. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked, suddenly aware of her inexperience in the social codes of high society. "I've never been to a dinner like this." Michael observed her for a moment, as if evaluating options. Finally, he sighed. "Be yourself," he said, surprising her. "Any attempt to pretend will only provoke Mrs. Thompson's suspicion. She has an infallible radar for detecting impostures." The Thompson mansion rose imposingly in the outskirts of Alexandria, Virginia, a stately 18th-century house surrounded by perfectly aligned vineyards that extended as far as the eye could see. The gravel path crunched under the wheels of the Mercedes as they approached the main entrance, where a butler of indefinite age awaited with the rigidity of one who has spent decades perfecting the art of servile invisibility. "Courage," Michael murmured, as he helped Emily descend from the vehicle. For the first time since she'd known him, the contact of his hand on hers seemed to seek to comfort rather than simply guide. Mrs. Thompson awaited them in the main hall, seated in an armchair that might well have been a throne by the way she occupied it. Despite her advanced age, she was nearing 90, according to what Michael had mentioned during the journey. Her posture was impeccably erect, and her penetrating gaze reflected an intact mental acuity. "At last, you deign to present your wife, Michael," was her greeting, without rising. I was beginning to wonder if the girl was imaginary. "Grandmother," he responded, leaning to kiss her cheek with a formality that revealed more tension than affection. "I present to you Emily Miller Thompson." The old woman scrutinized Emily with the intensity of an appraiser evaluating a potentially valuable jewel of dubious provenance. "Come closer, child," she ordered, gesticulating with a hand laden with ancient rings. "My eyes are not what they once were." Emily advanced, aware that each of her movements was being evaluated. She stopped before the matriarch and made a small curtsy she had mentally rehearsed throughout the journey. "It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Thompson," she said, grateful that her voice didn't betray the trembling she felt inside. "Eleanor," the old woman corrected. "If you're a Thompson now, you'll call me Eleanor. Mrs. Thompson makes me feel like the housekeeper." The dinner was a succession of exquisitely prepared dishes and incisive questions from Mrs. Thompson. She interrogated Emily about everything, from her humble South Carolina origins to the exact nature of her feelings toward her grandson, passing through her opinions on politics, art, and the future of Virginia. Each question was a potential trap. Each response was analyzed with the precision of a scientist studying a sample under the microscope. To Michael's surprise, who observed the exchange with growing tension, Emily didn't try to feign knowledge she didn't possess, nor pretend to be someone different from who she was. When she didn't know an answer, she admitted it with simplicity. When she disagreed, she did so with respect, but without yielding in her convictions. "And what do you think about the changing landscape of American agriculture, being from Charleston?" Mrs. Thompson asked at one point, while they enjoyed a sorbet of peach between courses. Michael visibly tensed. It was the kind of question designed to provoke an indiscreet response that would later be used as a weapon. "I believe feelings of identity are too deep to be judged from outside," Emily responded, after a moment of reflection. "I don't pretend to fully understand what it means to be a Virginia landowner, just as it would be difficult for you to understand what it means to grow up in a historic city where each stone tells a story. But I do understand the desire to preserve a culture and traditions, in that rural Virginia and historic Charleston aren't so different." A shadow of approval, fleeting but unmistakable, crossed the aristocratic face of the old woman. The decisive moment, however, came after dinner, when Mrs. Thompson insisted on showing Emily the mansion's music room. It was a magnificent chamber, with a Steinway grand piano as the centerpiece and perfect acoustics achieved through centuries of architectural refinements. "My son Edward, Michael's father, forbade music in this house after his wife abandoned us," the old woman commented, with a mixture of bitterness and nostalgia. "This room remained closed for nearly 30 years. I reopened it after his death just 5 years ago." Emily perceived the emotional weight behind those words, the pain of a family fragmented by absences and prohibitions. "Michael mentioned his mother played the piano," she said softly. "Wonderfully," confirmed Mrs. Thompson. "Laura had a special gift for Gershwin's preludes." Her gaze was lost for an instant in the past. "Do you play, Emily?" "Yes, a little," she responded with modesty. "Demonstrate," the old woman challenged her, pointing to the instrument. Emily sat before the piano, aware of the transcendence of the moment. Her fingers found the keys, and after an instant of hesitation, she began to play an old prelude by George Gershwin she had learned in her conservatory years. It was a melancholic and evocative melody, which spoke of land, nostalgia, and belonging. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that this was precisely the favorite piece of Laura Davis, Michael's mother, the woman who had abandoned her family to begin a new life in California when he was just 8 years old. When the last note extinguished in the air, an absolute silence filled the room. Emily turned and discovered Michael at the threshold of the door, completely motionless, with an expression she had never seen on his face, a mixture of astonishment, pain, and something very much like gratitude. Mrs. Thompson approached Emily and, in a completely unexpected gesture, took her hand between hers. "I believe, after all, my grandson has chosen well," she said, and for the first time her voice revealed a genuine warmth. The light from the photographic flashes was blinding. Emily blinked, momentarily disoriented by the luminous assault and the growing murmur of voices competing to be heard. Lincoln Center, New York's architectural jewel and acoustic temple, served that night as the stage for one of the most exclusive events of the Manhattan social season, the annual charity gala of the Thompson Foundation for the Arts. "Smile," Michael murmured near her ear, while his hand rested with gentle pressure on the small of her back, guiding her across the red carpet. "They're precisely expecting this, for us to appear uncomfortable. They, the investors, the competitors, the journalists, all those who, behind the scenes, knew about the financial problems Michael's company had faced months ago. All those who now scrutinized every gesture, every shared look between the businessman and his young wife, seeking to confirm the rumors of a marriage of convenience. The crisis had erupted the previous week. A crucial investor, Howard Jenkins, had threatened to withdraw the millions necessary for the company's expansion toward the West Coast, unless provided with additional guarantees of stability. His true concern, barely veiled under corporate euphemisms, was the nature of Michael's marriage. As the company lawyer had explained during a tense meeting, Jenkins considers an imminent divorce would be detrimental to the company's image in the conservative markets of Middle America. And so, overnight, the marriage that had begun as a private agreement transformed into a public spectacle. The instruction from the image consultants was clear. They should appear together at social events, project the image of a loving couple, convince the world, and especially Jenkins, of the solidity of their union. For Emily, who avoided crowds as if they were biblical plagues, the prospect was terrifying. Her anxiety had grown with each hour that brought them closer to the event, manifesting in cold hands and a persistent knot in her throat. "I can't do this," she had confessed that afternoon, while the makeup artist hired by Michael applied the finishing touches. "I don't know how to pretend to be in love in front of hundreds of people. I'm not an actress." Michael had observed her for a long moment before responding. In the last weeks, since the visit to Mrs. Thompson's mansion, something had changed between them. Conversations had become more frequent. Shared dinners were no longer the exception but the rule. And occasionally, just occasionally, she thought she glimpsed a spark of genuine interest in the grey eyes that before seemed to evaluate everything with clinical coldness. "Don't think about pretending," he had finally said. "Just be yourself. Talk about music, about Charleston, about the things that you're passionate about. I'll take care of the rest." Now, as they advanced through the Art Deco lobby of Lincoln Center, amid imposing columns and brilliant chandeliers, Emily tried to follow this advice. She breathed deeply, seeking to concentrate on the architectural details to distract herself from the constant scrutiny. The cobalt blue silk dress she wore, personally chosen by Michael's assistant, felt like an alien second skin, beautiful but strange. "Michael, darling, what a joy to see you finally accompanied." The honeyed voice belonged to a spectacular woman with platinum hair and a calculated smile, who approached them with the determination of a guided missile. "And this must be the mysterious wife everyone is talking about." "Victoria," Michael greeted with a cordiality that didn't reach his eyes. "Allow me to introduce Emily, my wife." Emily Victoria Blackwell, society editor for New York Style. The woman studied Emily as one examining a particularly interesting insect. "Charming," she finally pronounced. "So, authentic. Tell me, dear, what's it like to pass from bucolic Charleston to the most exclusive circles of New York? It must be like a fairy tale." The condescending tone was unmistakable. Emily felt her mouth go dry, aware that any response would be mercilessly dissected in the pages of the magazine. "Actually," Michael intervened before she could respond, taking her hand between his with surprising naturalness, "I'm the one who feels like I'm in a fairy tale. Emily has brought music to a house that had been silent for too long." The unexpected sincerity in his voice disconcerted both Victoria and Emily herself. It wasn't the rehearsed comment of a husband fulfilling a role, but something that sounded dangerously close to the truth. "How poetic," Victoria responded, quickly composing herself. "You'll have to tell me more during dinner. They've seated you at my table." Throughout the night, Emily discovered something unexpected. It was easier than she had feared, not because she had suddenly developed acting skills, but because, paradoxically, the most convincing performances were those that involved the least acting. When she spoke of her passion for the piano, of the cobblestone streets of Charleston bathed in the sunset light, or of the first time she heard Gershwin, her genuine enthusiasm captivated the listeners more than any fabricated story. And Michael constantly surprised her. His hand found hers under the table at the precise moments when her anxiety threatened to overflow. He skillfully deflected questions that were too personal or potentially uncomfortable. And, most disconcerting of all, he looked at her with a warmth she had never seen before, as if he were truly proud to present her as his wife. "You're doing wonderfully," he whispered during a musical interlude, when the lights dimmed and the attendees directed their attention to the stage where a soprano was performing arias from American operas. "Do you think so?" she asked, insecure. "I feel like an imposter." "You're the most authentic person in this room full of falsities," he responded, and for a moment, a very brief instant, his fingers brushed her cheek in a caress so fleeting that afterward Emily would wonder if she had imagined it. At the end of the night, while they waited for the chauffeur to bring the car, Jenkins approached them. He was a corpulent man with a lustrous bald head and small eyes that constantly evaluated potential profit margins. "Her charming evening," he commented, shaking Michael's hand with excessive force. "And I must say, Thompson, your wife is delightful. So refreshing to find authenticity in these circles, don't you think?" "Emily is unique," Michael responded, and although his tone was perfectly polite, there was a nuance of warning under his words, as if establishing an invisible boundary. Jenkins smiled, showing teeth too white to be natural. "The terms we discussed remain in place," he said, abruptly shifting to business. "My lawyer will contact yours tomorrow to finalize the details." When the investor walked away, Emily turned to Michael. "Does that mean it worked? That he's convinced?" "It seems so," he responded, but his expression was strangely thoughtful, which is curious because I myself am not sure what's real and what isn't at this point. The comment floated between them throughout the return journey, an enigma that neither dared to decipher. The discovery happened by accident. One Sunday afternoon, while Michael attended an emergency meeting convened by the board of directors of his company, Emily found herself alone in the apartment, enjoying the tranquility she rarely experienced lately. Since the gala at Lincoln Center, her social agenda had unexpectedly filled. Lunches with wives of other businessmen, invitations to exhibitions, even an interview for a decoration magazine that wanted to photograph the home of the Thompson couple. The public farce had acquired a life of its own, and sometimes Emily surprised herself momentarily, forgetting that it was all an elaborate representation with an expiration date. The shared moments with Michael, the dinners, the nocturnal conversations, the occasional piano lessons that continued despite their busy schedules, began to weave a tapestry of everyday life that was dangerously comfortable. That afternoon, looking for a specific book Michael had mentioned during breakfast, a rare volume on 19th-century American composers, Emily ventured into his private office. It was a territory she normally respected as off-limits, but he himself had suggested she might find the book there, on the second shelf by the window. The office perfectly reflected its occupant's personality, ordered to the point of obsession, with each object placed with millimetric precision. The books, organized by themes and then alphabetically, occupied dark wood shelves that covered 2 complete walls. The mahogany desk, free of any unnecessary paper, dominated the space in front of windows that offered a privileged view of Central Park. She found the book exactly where he had indicated, but upon removing it, something fell to the floor with a dull thud. A small cedar box, the type that usually contains Cuban cigars. When she bent to pick it up, the lid opened, revealing its contents. Not cigars, but letters. Dozens of them, some yellowed by the passage of time, all with the same sender, Los Angeles, California. Emily hesitated. Reviewing someone else's correspondence went against all her principles of respect for privacy. But something, curiosity perhaps, or a deeper intuition, impelled her to take the first letter from the pile. The paper crackled under her fingers when she unfolded the pages, revealing an elegant and fluid handwriting. "My dear son, 5 years have passed since my departure, and I still haven't found the adequate words to explain the inexplicable. How do you tell a child that his mother loves him deeply, but not enough to stay? Such words don't exist, and perhaps that's why I've kept silent for so long." Emily stopped reading, suddenly aware of the magnitude of her intrusion. These were the letters of Laura Davis, Michael's mother, the woman who had abandoned her family to begin a new life in California when he was just a child. She was about to return the letter to its place when a phrase caught her attention. "I beg you, my little Michael, not to allow your heart to become as cold as your father's. Resentment is a poison one drinks expecting the other person to die. Don't let my absence transform you into someone incapable of feeling. Promise me that you'll keep your heart open, that you'll allow yourself to be vulnerable, that you won't confuse strength with insensitivity." The letter continued, but Emily couldn't continue reading. The pieces fit together with painful clarity. The man with whom she lived, the apparently cold and calculating businessman, wasn't naturally insensitive. He was a wounded child who had grown building ever higher walls to protect himself from a pain he had never completely processed. With reverential care, she returned the letter to the box and the box to its place on the shelf. The discovery weighed on her like an unsolicited responsibility. What to do with this knowledge? Would mentioning it be a violation of trust? Would not doing so be a form of dishonesty? She didn't have to deliberate long. That night, when Michael returned from his meeting, a single look at his face was enough to understand that he already knew what had occurred. "You found the letters," he said. It wasn't a question. Emily nodded, unable to lie. "I'm sorry. It wasn't my intention." "Mrs. Parker saw you," he interrupted, referring to the housekeeper who came 3 times a week. "She called me concerned, thinking it might be an intrusion." A tense silence settled between them. Michael poured himself a whiskey without offering her one, something unusual in the recent weeks when courtesy had become his norm. "Michael, how many did you read?" The coldness in his voice recalled the first days of their marriage, when they barely exchanged words. "Just one, and only a few lines," she responded, feeling that everything they had built between them was crumbling like a house of cards. "I stopped when I realized how personal it was." He took a long drink before responding. "My mother wrote religiously for 15 years, he said at last. 1 letter each month, never failing. Explanations, justifications, advice no one asked for." His laugh was completely devoid of humor. "My father intercepted them and kept them in his safe. He gave them all to me on the day I turned 23, just before announcing he would disinherit me if I ever tried to contact her." "And did you contact her?" Emily asked softly. "No." The word fell like a stone in still water. "By then, I had already learned the lesson. Feelings are a weakness others exploit. Emotional attachment is a luxury people like me can't afford." Emily felt something break inside her at that desolate declaration. Without thinking, she moved toward him and took his hands between hers. "That's not true, Michael," she said, with an intensity that surprised even herself. "Feelings aren't a weakness, they're what make us human. And you are profoundly human, even though you've spent half your life trying to hide it." The cold fury she saw ignite in his eyes made her instinctively step back. "Don't presume to know me from having read a letter in secret," he retorted, moving away. "This marriage is a business agreement, Emily. Don't confuse courtesy with intimacy or convenience with affection." The words hit Emily with the force of a physical slap. For weeks she had begun to perceive something real growing between them, but now she realized how unilateral that perception might have been, or worse still, how deliberately cultivated as part of his public performance. "You're right," she responded with dignity, refusing to show how much his words had hurt her. "It was a mistake to confuse things. It won't happen again." That night, for the first time since she had discovered the piano, Emily didn't play. And for the first time in weeks, Michael didn't dine at home. The silence in the apartment was deeper and more painful than ever, charged not with the initial indifference of their marriage, but with something much worse, the sensation of having briefly glimpsed something beautiful, only to see it disappear. The call came at the worst possible moment. 3 days after the discovery of the letters, when the tension between Michael and Emily had crystallized into a glacial courtesy that made their first weeks together seem warm by comparison. They barely spoke beyond what was strictly necessary, like 2 actors who have forgotten their lines, but find themselves obliged to remain on stage. It was her younger brother, James, who never called unless it was absolutely essential. The normally serene voice of the young seminary student was broken with worry. "Dad has had a collapse, Emily. It's not just stress. They've found documents, promissory notes signed with his name that he swears he never saw. William Peterson seems to be behind it all." William Peterson, the minority partner of her father in the vineyard, a man who had presented himself as a savior when the financial problems began. The same one who apparently had been forging her father's signature on documents that further compromised the family patrimony. "How much?" Emily asked, feeling a knot in her throat. "Everything," James responded, and in that single word was contained the magnitude of the catastrophe. If we don't get proof of the forgery in 2 weeks, we'll lose the house, the vineyards, everything. Dad won't be able to bear it. His health is already— I'm coming there, Emily interrupted him, making the decision instantly. I'll be in Charleston tomorrow. When she hung up, she discovered Michael at the threshold of the living room door. From his expression, it was evident he had heard at least part of the conversation. Problems in Charleston? He asked in a carefully neutral tone. Emily hesitated. The last meaningful words they had exchanged were those painful ones about the merely contractual nature of their relationship. Asking for his help now would be admitting a vulnerability she wasn't sure she could afford after his rejection. "Nothing I can't handle," she finally responded, adopting the same mask of indifference he seemed to prefer. Michael studied her for a long moment. Something indefinable crossed his face. Concern? Guilt? Before his expression returned to its habitual neutrality. "As you wish," he said simply, and went to his office. That night, while packing for her improvised trip, Emily found herself surprisingly affected by the prospect of leaving New York. It wasn't the city she regretted abandoning, but the moments of warmth she had experienced in that apartment she had never considered truly hers. The piano sessions, the nocturnal conversations, even the public appearances that, artifice though they were, had brought with them a proximity she now acutely missed. "Don't confuse courtesy with intimacy or convenience with affection," he had said. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps it had all been an elaborate fabrication to satisfy the expectations of investors and family members. But if so, why did it hurt so much? Charleston welcomed her with the comforting familiarity of its cobblestone streets and the aroma of magnolias that floated in the afternoon air. The family home, a century-old construction with an internal courtyard and climbing wisteria, stood in the historic district a few minutes from the Battery. Seeing it, Emily felt a contradictory mixture of relief at being home and strangeness at how quickly New York had begun to occupy a space in her heart. The situation was worse than James had described on the phone. Her father, Robert Miller, always a robust and energetic man despite his 60 years, seemed to have aged a decade in the months of her absence. His face, weathered by decades working under the southern sun, now showed a sickly pallor, and his hands that had harvested grapes, pruned vines, and supported his children, trembled slightly as they held the documents detailing the extent of the fraud. "I trusted too much, daughter," he confessed that night when they were finally alone. "William was my friend for 30 years before becoming my partner. I never thought he could—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Shame and incredulity competed in his expression, along with something Emily had never seen in him: defeat. The following days were a whirlwind of consultations with lawyers, review of documents, and visits to banks and notaries. The evidence against Peterson was circumstantial but convincing. Subtle discrepancies in signatures, documented meetings that Robert Miller swore he never had, transactions carried out while he was demonstrably elsewhere, but nothing solid enough to present before a court, not without the help of a legal team experienced in corporate fraud, a luxury the Miller family couldn't afford. It was during one of these interminable meetings, while a local lawyer explained with resignation the scarce options available, when the door of the small office opened without prior announcement. Michael Thompson entered the room as if it belonged to him, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than all the office furniture combined. Behind him came two men with briefcases that practically screamed, "Elite corporate lawyers." "I apologize for the interruption," he said with the quiet authority of one rarely questioned. "I'm Michael Thompson, Emily's husband." His gaze was directed at the local lawyer, who seemed as disconcerted as everyone else. "We appreciate your efforts, but from now on we'll take charge." The "we" didn't refer to him and Emily, but to him and the two legal sharks who accompanied him, as became clear in the following minutes. In a display of relentless efficiency, they took control of the situation, reviewed documents, asked incisive questions, and established an action plan with the precision of generals planning a military campaign. Emily observed everything, with a mixture of astonishment and confusion. She hadn't called Michael, hadn't asked for his help. In fact, they had barely exchanged any messages in the 5 days she had been in Charleston, and yet, there he was, mobilizing resources and exercising his influence as if the Miller family's problem were a personal priority. When they finally were alone, in the internal courtyard of the family home where magnolia trees cast dancing shadows on the whitewashed walls, Emily couldn't contain the question that burned in her throat. "Why are you here?" Michael looked at her as if the answer were obvious. "Your family is in trouble." "My family, not yours," she pointed out. "According to your own words, ours is a business agreement. There's no contractual obligation requiring your involvement in this." Something like pain briefly crossed the grey eyes that, under the amber light of the southern twilight, seemed almost golden. "You're right," he admitted. "There is no contractual obligation." The response, or rather the lack of one, hung suspended between them like an unformulated question. "You didn't have to come," Emily insisted, needing to understand. "Or send your lawyers, or—" "I wanted to come," he interrupted with a vehemence that surprised her. "I needed to come." "Why?" Michael averted his gaze, focusing it on the flagstones of the floor, as if they contained some secret code he had to decipher. "Because I said things I shouldn't have said," he finally responded. "Because I reacted from fear, not from truth. And because—" he paused as if the following words required physical effort. "Because you matter to me, Emily. More than I'm prepared to admit, even to myself." The confession, as unexpected as the sound of rain in the middle of the desert, left Emily momentarily speechless. Before she could respond, her father appeared in the courtyard, oblivious to the intensity of the moment he had just interrupted. "Michael, son," said Robert Miller with more animation than he had shown in days, "your lawyers are impressive. They say they have a plan to catch that scoundrel Peterson." The conversation was postponed as they immersed themselves in legal details and strategies, but something fundamental had changed between them. A truth had been pronounced and could no longer be ignored. The plan to expose William Peterson was as elegant as it was ruthless. Michael's lawyers had discovered a pattern in the forgeries. They had all been made on specific days, when Peterson knew Robert Miller would be busy at the local winemakers' cooperative, far from phones and witnesses. Additionally, they had located Peterson's former assistant, a young man with dependency problems who had been abruptly fired and who, now in recovery, was willing to testify about the documents his boss had ordered him to destroy. But the masterpiece of the plan was a trap. They would spread a rumor that a potential Chinese buyer was interested in acquiring the vineyards at an exorbitant price, with one condition: the transaction had to be carried out immediately with the signature of all partners. Knowing Peterson's greed, it was almost certain he would attempt to forge Robert Miller's signature once more to appropriate the majority of the benefit. "We just need him to sign where he shouldn't," Michael explained during a dinner in the family courtyard, "and we'll have direct proof of fraud, sufficient for any judge." The operation required perfect coordination and a network of contacts that only someone with Michael's influence could mobilize. Within days, Charleston began to fill with Chinese representatives, in reality private agents hired by Thompson's lawyers, who ostentatiously lodged at the Charleston Place Hotel, toured the vineyards taking photographs, and generated exactly the kind of rumors they needed for Peterson to take the bait. During those intense days of preparations, Emily discovered a side of Michael she had never seen in New York, the relentless but ethical strategist capable of anticipating each move of the adversary without crossing moral lines. It was fascinating to watch him in action, directing a complex operation with the same precision with which he executed corporate mergers. But even more revealing was the way he adapted to Charleston and the Miller family. Away from the controlled and sophisticated environment of New York, Michael seemed gradually more relaxed, almost as if letting fall an invisible weight. He accepted with naturalness invitations to eat in neighboring homes, where tables bent under the weight of homemade dishes. He listened with genuine interest to the stories of elderly residents about Charleston of old, and, to Emily's astonishment, even allowed himself to be dragged by James to a local bar where he ended up learning to play poker with the local retirees. "I never thought I'd see you playing cards with old Joe One-Eye and drinking sweet tea," she commented one afternoon, as they walked along the Battery, admiring the historic mansions that punctuated the urban landscape. "Neither did I," he acknowledged with a smile that completely transformed his face. "It's strange. All my life I've been surrounded by calculating people, always measuring each word, each gesture, evaluating costs and benefits of each human interaction. Here," he made a vague gesture toward the city that stretched before them, "here people simply are." "That's what I've always loved about Charleston," Emily confessed. "Its authenticity." They stopped at one of the viewpoints, silently contemplating how the sun began to descend, bathing the antebellum mansions in golden tones and transforming the harbor into a river of orange light. "Do you miss it?" Michael suddenly asked. "This life, this city?" The question contained layers of meaning that Emily wasn't sure she could completely decipher. "I miss the simplicity," she responded after a moment of reflection, "the certainty of knowing who I am and what my place is in the world. In New York, sometimes I feel like an instrument playing in the wrong orchestra." Michael observed her with intensity, as if trying to memorize every detail of her face. "What if the orchestra isn't wrong, just different? What if you could play in both in your own way?" Before Emily could respond, her phone vibrated, the signal they were waiting for. Peterson had contacted the supposed Chinese investors, eager to close the deal as soon as possible. The trap was closing. Events precipitated in the following 24 hours. The meeting was set in a luxury hotel in Colombia, neutral ground where Peterson felt secure. Michael's lawyers, along with a notary and 2 plainclothes officers, waited in rooms adjacent to the conference room. Everything was prepared, each contingency anticipated, except one: Emily's visceral reaction upon seeing William Peterson again, the man who had betrayed her father's trust and threatened to destroy the legacy of generations. Peterson was just as she remembered him, corpulent, around 50, with incipient baldness carefully disguised, and a smile that never reached his eyes. Seeing him shake her father's hand with false cordiality while holding in his briefcase the fraudulent documents he planned to present, awakened in Emily a fury she didn't know she could feel. "We should begin," said Peterson, addressing primarily the supposed Chinese investor. "Time is money, as you say." "One moment," Emily intervened, ignoring Michael's warning look. "Before signing anything, I'd like to clarify some details about the previous documents." Peterson looked at her with a mixture of condescension and irritation. "Dear Emily, business matters are complex. Perhaps you should leave this to us while I limit myself to playing piano and smiling, right?" she completed with a coldness that would have impressed Michael himself in his most calculating days. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, William. You see, I've been reviewing certain documents, specifically promissory notes supposedly signed by my father on very interesting dates." The color gradually abandoned Peterson's face as Emily continued, detailing with forensic precision the discrepancies in signatures, the impossible dates, the non-existent witnesses. With each word, the man's facade visibly crumbled. "This is absurd," he tried to defend himself, but his voice had lost all conviction. "Robert signed all those documents if now he pretends—" "Pretends what?" Emily interrupted. "Pretends he wasn't in Atlanta receiving chemotherapy on the day he supposedly signed the transfer of the northern vineyards. We have his medical record, William, and witnesses, and now—" She made a dramatic pause. "Now we also have this." She slid a manila envelope in his direction. Inside were photographs, Peterson in his office, practicing Robert Miller's signature on multiple sheets, with a meticulousness that could only qualify as criminal. Photos taken by his former assistant before being fired. What followed was anticlimactic. The entrance of the officers, the formal accusation, Peterson's pale resignation when he understood there was no escape. There were no pursuits or physical confrontations, just the silent crumbling of a man who had bet everything on the belief he could manipulate indefinitely those he considered weaker than himself. That night, as the family celebrated the victory with an improvised dinner in the courtyard, under stars that in New York were invisible due to light pollution, Michael observed Emily with an undecipherable expression. "You were magnificent today," he finally said when they were momentarily alone. "Relentless, precise, devastating. You reminded me of myself in my best negotiation moments." "I'm not sure that's a compliment," she responded, although she smiled. "It is," he affirmed with seriousness. "But it also made me realize something important." "What?" "How much I've underestimated you from the beginning." Michael took her hand, a gesture that had become frequent in recent days, but now seemed charged with a distinct meaning. "I thought I was protecting you, that you needed my help, but the truth is you're perfectly capable of fighting your own battles. Perhaps you always have been." The observation surprised her as much for its precision as for the implicit humility in it. This was a Michael distinct from the cold businessman of New York, and even different from the competent strategist of the previous days. He was a man capable of recognizing his own mistakes and recalibrating his perceptions. "We all need help sometimes," she responded softly. "Even the strongest." There was an unformulated question floating between them, a fundamental question that neither yet dared to articulate. When they returned to New York, what would become of them? Would they return to the roles established in their original agreement, or had something changed so profoundly that there was no going back? The return to New York brought with it a strange ambivalence. The Upper East Side apartment, with its ample spaces and Art Deco elegance, seemed simultaneously familiar and alien after the 2 weeks in the welcoming intimacy of the family home in Charleston. The sounds of the city, the constant traffic, the fragmented conversations of passers-by under the windows, the occasional sirens, formed a backdrop radically different from the birdsong and church bells that had accompanied their southern mornings. But the real challenge wasn't readjusting to the physical environment, but navigating the undefined emotional situation between her and Michael. During their stay in Charleston, they had found a shared rhythm, a way of being together that transcended the limits of their original agreement without ever being explicitly redefined. Now, back in the scene of their marriage of convenience, would they return to the previously established roles, or continue in this new territory without a name? The routine re-established itself gradually, but with subtle differences. Michael continued working long hours, but now sent messages when he was delayed. Shared dinners became habitual instead of exceptional. The piano lessons, temporarily interrupted during the crisis in Charleston, resumed with a Michael noticeably more relaxed about his beginner's mistakes. These were small but significant changes, like tiny cracks in a dam that could eventually lead to a greater transformation. It was during one of those lessons, approximately a week after their return, when the discovery occurred. Emily was explaining a particularly complicated passage of a simple sonata, leaning over the keyboard to demonstrate the correct fingering, when Michael commented distractedly, "Your birthday is next week, isn't it, the 18th? She turned, surprised both by the precise memory of the date and by the casual mention. "Yes, I'll be 21. I had thought we might celebrate it," he continued, with an unusual hesitation in his normally decisive tone. "Perhaps a weekend in the Hamptons. I know a small hotel in East Hampton that—" He interrupted himself at Emily's expression. "Did I say something wrong?" he asked, visibly confused. "No, it's just that—" Emily hesitated, searching for the right words. "I'm surprised, I suppose. I didn't think my birthday would be something we would have to—" Stage. The word hung between them, charged with all the weight of the ambiguity that characterized their current relationship. Stage implied continuing with the public representation of their marriage, maintaining appearances for the benefit of external observers. Michael looked at her with an intensity that made her hold her breath. "I wasn't thinking about staging it, Emily. I was thinking about celebrating it. Just the two of us. The distinction was crucial and they both knew it. It wasn't about a strategic social appearance, but something personal, private, potentially real." Before Emily could respond, the doorbell rang. It was the messenger from the legal firm that had represented her father in Charleston, bringing copies of all the documentation of the Peterson case for their personal archives. While Michael signed the receipt, Emily began to distractedly review the documents. Among them, she found a folder labeled Thompson-Miller Marriage Agreement, which contained copies of their own marriage contract. Something, curiosity perhaps, or a deeper instinct, led her to open the folder. Most of the content was familiar to her. The clauses about the duration of the marriage, 18 months, the required discretion, the financial arrangements for her family. But on the last page, almost as an afterthought, there was a clause she didn't remember having read before. Clause 17 by B. In case of early dissolution of the marriage agreement before the stipulated period of 18 months, whether by initiative of either party or by breach of the established conditions, the Miller party expressly renounces any financial or patrimonial compensation, with all previously agreed beneficial provisions in favor of Miller Vineyards LLC becoming null and void. Emily read and reread the paragraph, feeling something cold settling in her stomach. The implication was clear. If the marriage ended before the agreed 18 months, her family would receive nothing, remaining vulnerable once again. The most disturbing thing wasn't the clause itself, but the fact that Michael had never mentioned it. Not during the initial negotiations, not during the months of cohabitation, not even during the crisis in Charleston. It was an ace up his sleeve, a guarantee that she couldn't abandon the agreement without catastrophic consequences for her family. When she looked up, Michael was observing her from the threshold, his expression undecipherable. "You never told me about this clause," she said, pointing to the document with a hand that struggled not to tremble. "It didn't seem relevant to mention it," he responded, but something in his tone suggested he knew exactly why it was important. "It's standard in this type of agreements, a basic protection." Protection against what, exactly? The question emerged sharper than she intended. Against sudden changes of mind, mainly. Michael advanced into the living room, but stopped at a prudent distance, as if perceiving the invisible barrier that had been erected between them. "The lawyers insist on including them." "The lawyers, of course." Emily closed the folder with more force than necessary. "It wasn't you who decided to keep me tied to this agreement through financial threats." "It's not a threat, Emily." "No? Then tell me, if I decided to leave tomorrow, would you activate this clause? Would you leave my family unprotected again?" The direct question seemed to take him by surprise. His expression hardened, momentarily returning to the professional mask that had predominated in their first encounters. "It's a hypothetical question." "No, it isn't," she insisted. "It's perfectly concrete. After all that's happened after Charleston, after the piano lessons and the dinners and everything, if I decided I couldn't continue with this farce, would you use this clause against my family?" "I've never considered using that clause," he responded with careful precision. "I had no intention of mentioning it because it's never been relevant to my plans." "That doesn't answer my question." A tense silence stretched between them. Finally, Michael sighed. "I don't know, Emily. Honestly, I don't know." His voice had lost the defensive rigidity, revealing an uncertainty he rarely allowed himself to show. 6 months ago, I probably would have considered it a legitimate resource to protect my interests. Now, things are different." "Are they?" Emily felt a knot in her throat. "What's changed exactly, Michael? Because from where I stand, it seems I'm still an asset in your balance sheet, an investment that must be protected through punitive clauses." The words hit Michael like a physical slap. For an instant, he seemed genuinely hurt before his expression closed again. "Perhaps you're right," he said with a coldness that contradicted the vulnerability shown just moments before. "Perhaps nothing has really changed. Perhaps we've just been fooling ourselves." He headed toward the door, stopping only to take his coat and keys. "I have a business dinner," he announced, although Emily knew perfectly well there was no dinner scheduled for that night. "Don't wait up." When the door closed behind him, Emily remained motionless, still holding the folder with the document that had cracked the fragile trust built between them during the previous weeks. The most painful thing wasn't the discovery of the clause, but realizing how much she actually cared. Because if everything had simply been a business agreement as they had initially established, the clause would have been just another contractual detail, not a betrayal she felt lodged in the center of her chest. The October in New York brought with it persistent rains that transformed the streets into rivers of dark umbrellas and converted the sky into a leaden canvas. Since the discovery of the clause, the Upper East Side apartment had sunk into a silence deeper than that of their first days together. Michael and Emily coexisted like ghosts, occupying distinct planes of the same reality. They shared spaces, but rarely coincided. They exchanged functional words but avoided any real conversation. The piano lessons had ceased. The shared dinners were now memories. The only vestige of their brief rapprochement was the constant presence of fresh flowers in the apartment, a custom Michael had initiated after their return from Charleston, and which, for a reason neither mentioned, he refused to abandon. 3 weeks after their argument, Emily made a decision. She needed distance, perspective, a space to breathe away from the suffocating atmosphere of the apartment and the memories of what might have been. The perfect excuse arrived in the form of an invitation. The National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. was seeking guest pianists for a series of Christmas concerts. The morning she communicated her intention to apply, she expected resistance, perhaps even a veiled mention of the infamous clause. Instead, Michael simply nodded, his face carefully neutral as he stirred his coffee. "Sounds like a good opportunity," he said, with a formality that hurt more than any argument. "How long would you be gone?" 3 weeks if I'm selected, maybe more." Emily carefully observed his reaction, but it was like trying to read emotions in marble. The rehearsals would start at the beginning of November. Michael mentally consulted his calendar. I have a series of important meetings those weeks. The West Coast expansion is finally moving forward. It was information irrelevant to her decision, a detail that under normal circumstances he wouldn't have considered necessary to share. I won't be able to accompany you. I didn't expect you to, Emily responded, and although she tried to make it sound neutral, the words emerged with an edge of resentment. The silence that followed was charged with unconducted conversations, unoffered apologies, unconfessed feelings. Is this what you really want, Emily? Michael finally asked, with a voice so different from his habitual tone that it almost seemed to come from another person. Distance? For a moment she considered responding with complete honesty. No. What she wanted was clarity, certainty about what existed between them, the truth without hidden clauses or secret agendas. But the risk of such vulnerability seemed too great before the wall he had rebuilt. I think it would do us both good, she finally responded. A little space to think. Michael studied her for a long moment before nodding, as if he had found in her face the confirmation of something he already suspected. As you wish, he said simply, and returned to his coffee and the digital newspaper on his tablet, concluding the conversation. Washington, D.C. received her with open arms. She was immediately selected for the concerts and installed herself in a small apartment near the National Cathedral, provided by the chapter. The city, with its imposing monuments and vibrant cultural scene, offered the perfect counterpoint to the New York she had left behind. The first days she was completely absorbed in rehearsals. Music had always been her refuge, and now more than ever she immersed herself in it like one seeking salvation in sacred waters. The hours at the majestic cathedral's piano, one of the most important in the country, were moments of transcendence, where the complex feelings that agitated her heart found expression without need for words. But at nights, alone in the small apartment that seemed to amplify her solitude with its very modesty, thoughts about Michael returned with renewed intensity. She mentally reviewed each shared moment, each conversation, seeking clues about what had been real and what simple acting. The most persistent memory was that of those 2 weeks in Charleston, the image of Michael integrating into the life of the city, learning to play poker with the elderly, savoring with genuine enthusiasm homemade dishes, listening with respectful interest to local stories. Could it all have been an elaborate representation, or had she glimpsed the true man beneath the armor of the ruthless businessman? One afternoon, while practicing a complex Bach passage she never seemed to completely master, she received an unexpected visit. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, Michael's formidable grandmother, advanced through the central nave of the cathedral with the same regal dignity she had exhibited in her Alexandria mansion, barely slowed by her 90 years and a dark wood cane. "Your interpretation of Bach needs more heart and less technique, child," was her greeting, as she settled on one of the benches near the piano. "You play as if you were dissecting the piece instead of feeling it." Emily, surprised by the appearance and the comment, could only blink confusedly. "Mrs. Thompson, I didn't expect— How did you know where to find me?" The old woman snorted as if the question were absurd. "I'm a Thompson. Knowing things is what we do." She lightly tapped the floor with her cane. "Come, sit with me. My old bones won't endure these uncomfortable medieval benches for long, so I'll be brief." Obediently, Emily came down from the piano and took a seat beside the matriarch. In the reverent silence of the cathedral, with light filtered through century-old stained glass, creating polychromatic patterns around them, the conversation acquired an almost confessional air. "My grandson is an idiot," Mrs. Thompson declared without preambles. "A brilliant idiot in business, certainly, but a complete inept when it comes to the heart. He inherited that from his father, I'm afraid, along with that irritating tendency to believe he can control the world through contracts and clauses." Emily remained silent, unsure how to respond to such a direct assessment. "What he didn't inherit from Edward, thank God, and despite his best efforts, is the total incapacity to love," the old woman continued. "My son was an iceberg even before Laura abandoned him. Michael, on the contrary." Her voice softened almost imperceptibly. "Michael simply learned to hide his heart so deeply that sometimes he forgets where he stored it." "Why are you telling me all this, Mrs. Thompson?" Emily finally asked. The old woman looked at her as if the answer were obvious. Because I've spent 70 years watching the men in my family ruin their lives in the name of pride and fear, and frankly, I'm too old to witness another generation committing the same mistakes. She took Emily's hand between hers, a surprisingly tender gesture coming from such a formidable woman. I didn't come to tell you what to do. I came to ask you something important. What is it you truly want, Emily Miller? The question, so simple, yet so profound, completely disarmed Emily. For months she had been reacting to circumstances, adapting to situations created by others, responding to the needs of her family or the conditions established by Michael. When had she last considered her own desires? I don't know, she finally confessed, and the admission felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating. Everything has been so confusing. The agreement, New York, the music, him. Her voice broke slightly. Sometimes I think I know what I feel, and the next moment I doubt everything. Mrs. Thompson nodded, as if the response confirmed something she already knew. Doubt is natural when we've been too long allowing others to define our path. She rose with surprising agility for her age. But remember this, child. Clarity never comes through distance but through truth. And the most important truth is always the one we tell ourselves. With those enigmatic words, the old woman began to move away. Before disappearing through the cathedral's side door, she turned one last time. My grandson will be in Chicago next week, at the Drake Hotel, in case that information proves useful for your reflections. And with that she disappeared, leaving Emily alone with questions she hadn't considered before, and a growing certainty that the most important decisions of her life couldn't continue being postponed. Chicago in November was a study in blues and grays, with Lake Michigan reflecting changing skies and the city rising like a promise from the shore. Emily contemplated this panorama from the window of her room at the Drake Hotel, where she had arrived the previous afternoon after an impulsive flight from Washington, D.C. She hadn't warned Michael of her arrival. She wasn't sure what she would say when she saw him, nor even how he would react to her unexpected presence. She only knew with a certainty that transcended logic that they needed to meet on neutral ground, far both from the New York that represented their business agreement and the Charleston that had glimpsed different possibilities. The hotel, a historic and elegant building, was exactly the type of establishment Michael preferred, sophisticated without ostentation, with discretion as a fundamental principle and impeccable service. According to her inquiries, a simple consultation at reception where she mentioned being Mrs. Thompson, he was staying in a suite on the 4th floor and had meetings scheduled until mid-afternoon. While waiting, Emily tried to organize her thoughts. Mrs. Thompson's words had acted as a catalyst, crystallizing feelings that had been forming beneath the surface for months. It was no longer simply about clarifying the nature of her relationship with Michael, but something more fundamental, defining who she herself was and what she truly wanted from her life. A knock on the door interrupted her reflections. Upon opening it, she found herself facing a visibly tense Michael, still dressed in his business meeting suit, but with his tie slightly loosened, a sign of agitation in a habitually impeccable man. The receptionist mentioned my wife had arrived, he said as his only greeting, his voice controlled but with a barely perceptible tremor. I thought it must be a mistake. It wasn't, Emily responded simply, stepping aside to let him enter. Michael advanced to the center of the room and stopped, as if unsure what to do next. It was the first time Emily had seen him genuinely disconcerted, without a calculated plan or a predefined strategy. Why are you here, Emily? He finally asked. It was the obvious question, the one she had anticipated, and yet facing it she discovered she didn't have a rehearsed answer. Because I was tired of distance and silence, she said, with an honesty that surprised even herself. Because I think we deserve a real conversation. No more evasions, no more half-truths. He observed her for a long time, as if evaluating the sincerity of her words. Finally, in a gesture that seemed to cost him considerable effort, he removed his jacket and carefully placed it over the back of a chair. I've spent the last 3 weeks trying to convince myself this is for the best, he said, vaguely indicating the space between them. This distance, this clarity of purpose, returning to our original agreement, without emotional complications. And did it work? Emily asked softly. Did you manage to convince yourself? A humorless smile briefly curved his lips. "Not for a moment," he confessed. "It turns out I'm much better at convincing board directors than myself." He approached the window, contemplating the city stretching before them. The twilight began to tinge Chicago with golden tones, softening its contours, transforming the everyday into something almost magical. "When I proposed this marriage," he continued after a moment without turning, "I had everything calculated. Each benefit, each risk, each controlled variable. Even that clause that bothered you so much. It was just another way to ensure that nothing unforeseen could divert the plan." "And what was the plan exactly?" Emily asked, approaching but maintaining a prudent distance. 18 months of formal but distant marriage. Satisfy my grandmother to secure the inheritance. Reassure nervous investors. Afterward, a friendly and discreet separation. You would return to Charleston with enough money to save the family business. I would continue with my life as if nothing had happened. The clinical coldness with which he described the original plan should have scandalized Emily, but strangely she only felt a profound sadness. How lonely must be the existence of a man who planned even his personal relationships with the same precision as a business acquisition. "What went wrong?" she asked, though she already intuited the answer. Michael finally turned toward her, and the vulnerability in his gaze was as unexpected as it was moving. "You," he said simply. "You and your music, you and your honesty. You and the way you illuminated corners of my life that had been in darkness for so long that I had forgotten they existed." He took a step toward her, eliminating part of the distance that separated them. "The night I found you playing the piano, something changed inside me. It was as if someone had opened a window in a room sealed for decades, and no matter how much I tried to close it again, it was already too late." I had already breathed fresh air. Emily felt her eyes fill with tears, not of sadness but of recognition, because she had experienced something similar, a gradual but irrevocable transformation that had begun as a pragmatic agreement and converted into something that had no name but occupied every corner of her heart. "When I discovered that clause," she confessed, "it wasn't the content that hurt me. It was realizing how much it mattered to me that you had hidden something from me, that everything I was beginning to feel might be unilateral." "I never intended to use that clause against you," he responded, his voice laden with regret. "But I also didn't have the courage to eliminate it, because doing so meant admitting my feelings had changed, that I was no longer following the plan." "And now? Are you following the plan now?" Emily asked, aware that the answer would define everything that came after. Michael slowly shook his head. "The plan disintegrated months ago, probably since that first night at the piano." He extended his hand toward her, a gesture of offering more than demand. "What I don't know is if a new path is possible, or if I've destroyed any opportunity with my fears and my silences." Emily looked at the extended hand, feeling she was at a vital crossroads. She could step back, protect herself, maintain the walls that both had built during these weeks of separation. Or she could step forward, toward uncertainty but also toward the possibility of something authentic. "My grandmother once told me that true courage isn't in the absence of fear, but in the decision to advance despite it," she said finally, as her hand found Michael's. "I think we've both been too long allowing fear to dictate our decisions." Their fingers intertwined, and the simple contact seemed to dissolve some of the tension accumulated over weeks. "What do we do now?" he asked, and there was an almost youthful vulnerability in the question, so different from his habitual certainty. "I suggest we begin with something radical," Emily responded with a small smile. "The truth. The whole truth, without hidden clauses or secret agendas." The proposal floated between them like a promise and a challenge. And as the sun set over Chicago, bathing the room in amber tones, both understood they were on the verge of something new. Not a business agreement disguised as marriage, but an authentic possibility built on the honesty they had so long avoided. The vineyard stretched before them like a green sea under the June sun, each vine an island of promised shade in the Carolina heat. From the terrace of the family home, newly renovated with the proceeds of an exceptional harvest, Emily and Michael contemplated the sunset with the tranquility of those who have learned the value of shared silence. 18 months. The exact term they had agreed for their marriage of convenience was fulfilled precisely on this day. The irony hadn't escaped either of them, though they rarely mentioned that figure which once represented a deadline, and now meant nothing more than another day in a life built with daily decisions to remain together. "What are you thinking about?" Michael asked, observing Emily's contemplative expression as she distractedly caressed the keys of the small piano they had installed on the terrace, a whim he had insisted on including during the renovation. "About dates and deadlines," she responded with a soft smile, "about how numbers that once seemed to define everything are now simply numbers." He nodded, immediately understanding the reference. With a gesture that had become natural over time, he took her hand and brought it to his lips. A small act of devotion he repeated often, as if he still marveled at being able to do so. The months that had passed since their encounter in Chicago had been a constant recalibration, a mutual learning filled with advances and setbacks. They had tried something radical, absolute honesty, even when it hurt, even when it exposed vulnerabilities that both would have preferred to keep hidden. It hadn't been easy. The transition from a transactional agreement to a genuine relationship had required dismantling protective structures built over decades. For Michael, it meant recognizing and processing his mother's abandonment and the damage caused by an emotionally absent father. For Emily, it involved finding her own voice and learning to occupy space in a world she had until then only experienced from the margins. The solution, surprisingly simple but profoundly transformative, had emerged during those first conversations in Chicago. They wouldn't try to fix their paper marriage, but start anew, as if the contract had never existed. They wouldn't be husband and wife by legal decree, but two people consciously choosing to build something together, day by day. The document formalizing this decision, the effective annulment of the original contract and all its clauses, including the infamous 17B, was the last legal act between them. From that moment on, there remained only Michael and Emily, without titles or contractual obligations, just the mutual commitment to genuinely try. The first months had been a delicate balance between New York and Charleston. He had restructured his company to be able to work remotely part of the time. She had accepted opportunities as a concert pianist that regularly took her to the metropolis. They had learned to value both the vibrant energy of the big city and the comforting peace of the southern town. The renovation of the family home in Charleston, where they now spent at least half their time, had been one of the projects that had most united them. Each decision, from preserving the century-old ceiling beams to installing modern technology that allowed Michael to manage his international business, had been jointly discussed and agreed upon, a constant exercise in communication and compromise. "My grandmother called this morning," Michael commented, interrupting Emily's thoughts. "She insists we visit Alexandria next month for her birthday." "Do you think she suspects something?" Emily asked with a conspiratorial smile. The Thompson matriarch, who had initially been the principal reason for their marriage of convenience, had paradoxically become one of its firmest defenders when it transformed into something real. The old woman, with her legendary perspicacity, had perceived the change in their relationship, even before they had completely verbalized it themselves. "My grandmother suspects everything on principle," Michael responded with a soft laugh. "But in this particular case, I think she's trying not to appear too expectant, which, knowing Mrs. Thompson, means she's absolutely certain." What the old woman suspected, and that they hadn't yet confirmed to anyone, was the news they had received just a week ago. Emily was expecting a child. The confirmation, received at the small Charleston clinic with the doctor who had attended the Miller family for generations, had been as unexpected as it was perfectly timely. They hadn't planned this pregnancy, just as they hadn't planned falling in love in the first place, but the news, far from generating anxiety, had provoked a kind of astonished gratitude in both. It was, in some way, the physical materialization of everything they had built together, unforeseen but deeply desired, an act of creation that transcended any agreement or contract. "We should tell her when we visit," Emily suggested. "It will be a better birthday gift than anything we could buy. We'll have to endure months of 'I knew it,' and it was just a matter of time," Michael warned, though his expression made clear the prospect amused rather than bothered him. "A small price to pay," she responded, instinctively bringing a hand to her still flat stomach. Besides, technically she was right from the beginning. About what? About you needing to get married. Just not for the reasons she believed. Michael looked at her with an intensity that still, after all this time, had the power to quicken her pulse. "I think even in that she was wrong," he said softly. "I didn't need to get married. I needed you." The rest was circumstantial. The words, simple but profound, perfectly captured the transformation they had both experienced. What had begun as a pragmatic agreement between strangers had become a conscious choice between two people who had learned, sometimes painfully, to tear down walls and build bridges. The sun began to hide behind the trees, painting the vineyard with copper and golden tones. In the distance, the bells of the church where Emily had played the piano for years announced the end of the day. "Would you play something?" Michael asked, pointing to the piano. "That piece you were composing last week." Emily smiled. The composition was a personal project she had recently initiated, a piece that attempted to capture their joint history, from the initial coldness to the current warmth, passing through all the intermediate tonalities of discovery and conflict. Her fingers found the keys, with the familiarity of one who recognizes the path home, even in darkness. The notes ascended in the southern evening air, mixing with the aroma of magnolia and warm earth. As she played, she felt Michael's hand rest gently on her shoulder, and in that simple contact was contained the entire history they had traversed together. The initial fear, the gradual discovery, the painful rupture, the honest reconciliation, and finally, this shared peace that neither had believed possible 18 months ago. The last note of the composition, still unfinished like their own story, floated in the air like a promise of future movements yet to be written. A year later, the backyard garden of the Charleston home was resplendent under the filtered light of lanterns strategically placed among magnolia trees and climbing roses. The celebration was intimate but significant. The first birthday of Eleanor, Emily and Michael's daughter, and simultaneously the second anniversary of what they privately called the true beginning. That encounter in Chicago, where they had decided to leave behind the contract and venture into a genuine relationship. Little Eleanor slept peacefully in her crib, placed in the shade of a century-old wisteria, oblivious to the soft murmur of conversations and laughter that surrounded her. Her face, a perfect combination of both parents' features, occasionally showed unconscious smiles that Mrs. Thompson insisted were a sign of a spirit dreaming with angels. The Thompson matriarch, who had made the journey from Alexandria despite her 92 years, moved among the guests with the energy of someone decades younger, clearly revitalized by her role as great-grandmother. To everyone's surprise, especially Michael's, the formidable old woman had developed an unexpected friendship with Robert Miller, Emily's father, based on their shared love of gardening and a mutual admiration for each other's strength in the face of adversity. "I never thought I'd see my grandmother exchanging advice on pruning roses," Michael commented to Emily, as they observed the two elderly people engrossed in an animated discussion about the best way to protect plants from the excessive southern sun. "Or my father trying to speak like an aristocrat," she responded with a smile, indicating how Robert Miller attempted to adopt Mrs. Thompson's refined vocabulary, provoking appreciative laughter from the old woman. The celebration had united their two worlds, the complete Miller family, including James, who had recently taken his vows after completing his seminary training, some close Charleston friends who had known Emily all her life, and a small New York contingent, composed of Michael's personal assistant and her family, plus two business associates who over time had become friends. Notably absent was the division that had once existed between these universes. There was no longer your people and my people, only people important in their shared lives. As the afternoon advanced toward twilight, Emily found herself momentarily alone, observing the scene from the small elevation where they had installed the outdoor piano. The image before her, the harmonious mixture of people of different origins and ages united by affection, the garden they had restored together, the house they had transformed from a space of nostalgic memories into a vibrant home, seemed the physical materialization of everything they had built in these years. "Are you happy?" Michael's voice, soft near her ear, startled her slightly. She hadn't felt him approach. It was a question they asked each other with certain frequency, not out of insecurity, but as a conscious reminder to value what they had, to never take for granted the life they had chosen to build together. "Deeply," she responded, leaning back against him as his arms encircled her from behind. "And you? More than I thought possible," he said, And though she couldn't see his face, Emily knew exactly the expression that accompanied those words, a mixture of gratitude and wonder that appeared each time he contemplated the life they now shared. The path hadn't been simple. They had faced considerable challenges, the initial resistance of some of Michael's partners to his decision to divide his time between New York and Charleston, the logistical complications of maintaining two functioning homes, even a brief period of distancing during the pregnancy, when old fears had resurfaced before the prospect of parenthood, particularly for Michael, who feared repeating the emotional patterns of his own father. But each obstacle had been confronted with the same determination that had led them to Chicago that decisive afternoon. Radical honesty, even when it hurt, commitment to the process, not just the result, and the shared conviction that what they were building deserved the effort, however difficult it might sometimes be. "I have something for you," Michael said, interrupting her reflections. From his pocket he extracted a small envelope. "I was going to wait until everyone left, but the moment seems right." Intrigued, Emily opened the envelope. Inside was a simple bronze key with an antique design, accompanied by a photograph of what appeared to be a country house beside a lake. "It's a 19th-century farmhouse near Shenandoah," he explained, as Emily examined the image. "It needs renovation, but the surroundings are beautiful. I thought it could be our intermediate place, neither New York nor Charleston, but something new. A space we can create together from scratch." The consideration behind the gift moved her deeply. It wasn't just a property, it was a recognition that they both occasionally needed neutral territory, a place that wasn't charged with the individual history of either one. "It's perfect," she said, turning to look at him directly. "Though we'll need to install a piano." "It's already considered in the preliminary plans," he responded with a smile. "In the main room with large windows toward the lake, and an acoustic space in the basement for when you need to practice at odd hours." "You know me too well," she laughed. "Not well enough yet," he responded with seriousness. "But we have time." The comment, simple but charged with meaning, perfectly summarized the understanding they had reached, that truly knowing each other was a continuous process, not a destination, that each day brought new discoveries, new layers of complexity and beauty in the other. A soft cry interrupted their private moment. Eleanor had awakened and was claiming attention with the determination she already showed in her character, a combination of Emily's southern tenacity and Michael's northeastern resolution. As they both approached the crib, Robert Miller announced it was time for the cake. James appeared with a guitar, ready to accompany the happy birthday song everyone prepared to sing. Life continued its course, with its mixture of transcendent moments and daily routines, big decisions and small joys. Later that night, when all the guests had left and Eleanor was sleeping again, Emily and Michael found themselves alone in the garden, under a starry sky that only the darkness of small towns allows one to appreciate in all its glory. "Do you know what day it is today?" she asked as they sat on the stone bench beside the small pond they had built the previous summer. "Eleanor's birthday," he responded automatically. "Besides that," Emily insisted, "today would mark exactly the 18 months of our original agreement, the day when, according to the papers, we would have ended our marriage of convenience." Michael considered the information for a moment, a smile slowly forming on his lips. "Life has a peculiar sense of humor," he finally said. "What do you mean?" "That I signed that contract believing I was securing my financial future, maintaining absolute control over my life. And it turned out to be precisely the opposite. The beginning of a journey where I had to learn to release control, to trust, to be vulnerable." He took her hand between his. "Sometimes I think that of all the legal documents I've signed in my life, that was the only truly transformative one, though not in the way I expected." Emily nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. For her, too, what had begun as a sacrifice for her family had become a path toward a version of herself she had never imagined. Stronger, more secure, capable of occupying space in the world without apologizing for existing. "Do you know what Mrs. Thompson told me today?" she asked, recalling her private conversation with the old woman during the party. "That she always knew we would end up like this, not because of her manipulations or the contract, but because she saw something in us from the first moment, something that neither you nor I could see yet." "Did you believe her?" Emily laughed softly. "Not for a second, but I liked the story." There's a certain charm in thinking the universe knew what it was doing, even when we were completely lost. Michael smiled, drawing her closer as they contemplated the stars that speckled the southern sky. Maybe not the universe, but perhaps our hearts did know, he suggested, even when our minds were occupied with contracts and clauses. In the silence that followed, with the soft murmur of water in the pond and the occasional hooting of an owl in the distance, Emily thought about all the invisible contracts people sign throughout their lives, the unwritten commitments, the silent promises, the tacit agreements that shape our relationships and define who we are. And how sometimes it is precisely when those contracts break or transform that we find our true nature. "We should go to sleep," she finally whispered, aware that tomorrow Eleanor would wake them with the dawn, inexorable in her routine. "It's been a long day." Michael nodded, but neither made any move to leave. There was something magical in that moment, in the quietness of the garden under the stars, in the tranquil certainty that whatever path lay ahead, they would travel it together. "One more minute," he asked, and she recognized in his voice the same desire she felt, to prolong this perfect instant, to guard it like a treasure in the collection of moments that formed their shared history. And so they remained in that garden they had transformed with their own hands, under a sky that had witnessed countless love stories throughout the centuries, with the certainty that theirs, born from a cold contract and flourished against all odds, was exactly as it should be, imperfect, unpredictable, and profoundly real.